For joining. My name is Dan Zinn. I'm the General Counsel of OTC Markets Group. I'm joined by my colleague Chris Bach, who is our Chief Compliance Officer. You are all here to attend a CAT Phase 2D overview, and lucky all of you are to be here. We're going to go through, and really Chris is going to go through a lot of information relevant to the upcoming Phase 2D implementation. This is the first in what will be a few of these types of webinars. We plan to do maybe one more in August and another in September to keep everybody informed as the dates get closer. For purposes of this webinar, just some housekeeping items before I turn things over to Chris. First, everyone is in a listen-only mode, which means you're on mute. If you have a question, you should see a box that popped up on your screen when you logged in that has a question tab. You can type your questions directly into it. They will accumulate, and we will try to answer them towards the end of the presentation. To the extent you ask a question that we don't get to, or you have a question afterwards, let us know, and we will try to get back to any questions that we were unable to hit during the presentation itself. Final note is that this is being recorded, and for everyone who is in attendance now, we will send out a link likely tomorrow to the recording so that you can listen to it again and go through. And then again, if questions arise as you do that, please feel free to reach out to us. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris to take you through the presentation. Go ahead, Chris.
Great, thanks, Dan. Good afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to spend a Wednesday afternoon with us to talk about the consolidated audit trail. What we want to achieve today is just to provide kind of the landscape of what will be required of OTC link subscribers in terms of CAT reporting obligations once Phase 2D goes live in 5 months. Kind of as some background, it's important to note that you all know this, but there is a pretty wide delta in how trade messages are constructed within OTC Link ATS's IDQS versus how firms have traditionally defined an order. And that's kind of the core change in what would be required once 2D goes live in terms of reporting OTC Link trade messages in the form of an order event. So the core question that I hope we can kind of run through today in the context of the underlying market structure is what's unique to Link ATS that's not associated with the traditional order-based infrastructure. And again, as you all know, OTC Link ATS does not have a concept of an order within our systems. OTC Link ATS is a interdealer quotation system that allows subscribers to publish quotes in OTC equity securities, and trade message functionality that is simply a mechanism to communicate buy and sell interest directed to and from a market maker quote. Right, so we don't define trade messages as orders. They're analogous to phone conversation, Bloomberg chat message, or any other non-order-based communication. However, CAT did, through kind of years of negotiation, ultimately define OTC Link trade messages as orders for the purposes of CAT. And I want to distinguish orders for the purposes of CAT versus OTC Link trade messages as understood by everyone on this call. CAT requires OTC Link trade messages to be reported in the same construct as orders, but OTC Link ATS and our subscribers shouldn't assume that that's going to impact how Link ATS defines trade messages. The construct is going to be the same. Trade messages can still be sent and received to quoting participants outside of the scope of an order, right? So none of that changes. The core question that we've received over the past year or so is, what are the obligations and what are the challenges associated with reporting trade messages in the form of an order event. So the new order, the order route, the order accept event construct. I think the good news that we hope to share today is from a message and protocol perspective, there really isn't changes to the underlying fixed messaging that separates the linked trade messages from a fixed order. The values within our fixed trade message specification do align with the CAT order events as kind of highlighted in the spec. And aside from a few instructions that will designate the destination counterparty, there really shouldn't be any heavy lift in terms of implementation. I think the other item that I just want to note, just for completeness, is OTC link ATS has never been the party to a trade. We don't consider ourselves the route and destination nor an execution venue. However, for CAT reporting purposes, OTC link ATS will be a route and destination. Both trades sent inbound as well as outbound trades. So again, I don't want to necessarily conflate that with the fact that we're receiving the order, but from a messaging directional point of view, OTC link will always be in the middle of the trade message sent to and from OTC link subscribers. Just that, if we can go to the next slide. So really the kind of the core workflows that are going to be in scope are any trade message sent to and from another OTC link subscriber counterparty in the form of an order event, as well as electronic quotes sent via an electronic system to OTC link ATS. To kind of distinguish what OTC is and OTC is not, I think is important, again, to try to get some contextual background in terms of what changes in CAT Phase 2D. So OTC link ATS, again, is a IDQS that provides subscribers a platform in which they can publish quotes, as well as trade messaging functionality that enables subscribers to communicate buy and sell interest directed to quoting participants. OTC link is not a route and destination, as I mentioned before. It's not an execution venue. It's never going to be a party to the trade. For the purposes of CAT, OTC link ATS sits in the middle of the trade because CAT was essentially unable to construct the model to kind of reflect our unique market structure. So again, CAT accounts for that by designating the delivered to, delivered from handle instructions on the order accept events to designate who the route and destination ultimately is. And we'll discuss that in a minute. Can you go to the next slide? So again, unlike most CAT order-based events, OTC link ATS subscribers, as well as OTC link ATS, are going to be required to report certain quote events to reflect the market maker quote sent and displayed on OTC link IDQS, as well as trade messages. So in terms of quotes, quotes will require OTC link subscribers who use fixed or an OMS system to send quotes to OTC link IDQS for display will be required to report the new quote event, the quote route event, as well as a quote status event that we'll discuss in a second. Quotes sent via OTC dealer or any other non-electronic system are not reportable until at least July 31st, 2023. There is some exemptive relief granted about 8 months ago that delays reporting obligations for any manual quote events and that applies to both OTC equities as well as NMS equities and options. So for firms who do not send OTC link IDQS quotes for display electronically, there's going to be no reporting obligation. The only obligation would be the reportable quote received event that OTC link IDQS has reported since the beginning of phase 2A. So none of that will change. In terms of trade messages, the biggest difference obviously between OATS and earlier phases of CAT is that the OTC link trade messages are going to be reported in the same construct as an order event, with the OTC link ATS as the route and destination. So we'll discuss this in a second, but all trade messages, whether executed or not, will require the reporting of a new order event, an order route event, directed to OTC link. OTC link will then accept that order or trade message, excuse me, and then route that to the market maker destination, and then vice versa if there happens to be a counter message or some other negotiation. Giuseppe, you mind moving on to the next slide? From the previous slide, we touched upon the concept of manual versus electronic quotes. We'll discuss this in a little bit more detail because it's going to be important for firms to kind of understand what the obligation is in terms of reporting new quote and quotes on events. So again, manual quotes, and again, those are defined as any quotes sent via a system other than electronic. So the dealer being a good example of a manual system that would not require the associated quote to be reported to CAT. Those will be completely off the table, including the quote status event. The only reporting obligation until 2023 for quotes sent manually would be the quote received event that OTC link ATS reports. Electronic quotes, again, don't have the benefit of the exemptive relief. So electronic quotes, quotes sent to OTC link IDQS via an OMS are reportable, as I mentioned before. That is encompassing of a new quote event that reflects the kind of the material terms of the quote that will be sent to OTC link IDQS for display. The routed quote event. I think it's important just to keep in the back of your minds that the concept of a routed quote doesn't really exist. It's simply CAT's mechanism to communicate the communication of the quote from the subscriber to OTC link IDQS for display. The quote doesn't exist until OTC link displays it publicly within their IDQS. And then the quote status events will also have to be reported. The quote status event is a new event that reflects the change in the status of a quote. So generally open quote or close quote. Quotes, often will change status throughout the trading day. So anytime there is a change in the status of a quote from open to close or close to open, that will be reflected via a quote status event. For better or for worse, OTC link, as well as the subscriber, will report the MEQS event. So it'll be a two-sided report from the perspective of the subscriber, as well as OTC link ATS that reflects, again, the change of the status of the quote from open to close or close to open. The only time that a quote status event is not required to be reported by a subscriber would be the end of day close quotes. CAT considers end of day close quotes that OTC link would shut off as part of an automatic process that does not require the broker dealer to report the quote status event to reflect end of day close quotes. start of day open quotes or any other intraday change to the status of a quote would be reportable in the MEQS event. And Josette, if we can go to the next slide. So a new field or a new value that differs from OTS reporting obligations is the concept of a quote ID. And there's two utilities for the quote ID as it pertains to CAT. The first is on the new quote event. On the new quote event, the quote ID is intended to be the quote ID generated by the market maker who is sending the quote to OTC link IDQS. That field is simply for matching purposes. The quote ID, as well as the router quote ID, and then the associated received quote ID reported by OTC link participate in the matching criteria established for quote generation and routed quote events. That may or may not be the same quote ID that participates in the order route event. And what I mean by that is OTC link as a route and destination is always going to accept the inbound trade message from a subscriber, report a new order, or excuse me, an order accepted event, and then the associated order route event to the intended destination. When OTC link creates the order accepted event and the associated order route event to the destination, it will populate the quote ID of the quote subject to the trade message. And that's going to be the internal quote ID that OTC link generates. For firms that elect to use OTC link as a service bureau, in cases in which that's needed, OTC link would use the quote ID generated and reflected in the order route event as the same quote ID that we would generate and report in the new quote and routed quote event. For firms who do intend to report new quote and routed quote events to CAT in cases where you generate the new quote electronically, we would ask that you coordinate with OTC link. There may be some challenges associated with quote IDs that differ between the new quote and routed quote event or routed order route events. There may be some need for coordination, but again, I think for simplicity's sake, our recommendation is leveraging the quote ID that we generate in cases where firms do elect to report the new quote event on their own behalf. And that information can be found on the real-time multicast market data feed that's provided back almost real-time. So again, I just wanted to highlight kind of the different utilities of the quote ID. The quote ID and the new quote event may or may not match with the quote ID on the order route event. Obviously, our suggestion, our kind of objective is they do, but for firms who do not want to coordinate, just note that the quote ID that's reflected in the order route event that OTC link disseminates to the intended counterparty will be the quote ID that CAT essentially performs their surveillance under. Go to the next slide. So we just covered in the last two slides related to quotes. Again, relatively simple, similar to the concept of reporting new order and order route events, and the terminal destination will always be OTC link ATS in terms of quotes. It's really two events reportable by the broker dealer, and then the associated quote status event in cases where the broker sends quotes electronically. It's a bit more complex as we bring in trade messages, although probably a lot more familiar for most firms, because the trade message construct is going to look almost exactly like the order lifecycle events reflected in non-OTC equity scenarios. Just wanted to highlight the differences between 2A and 2C. 2A, CAT was designed to leverage the OTS reporting construct. So firms, subscribers are only required to report a new order event or an OTS the NW event in cases where the trade message resulted from an execution or vice versa. So in OTS and earlier phases of CAT, there was no concept of a new order event reported without an associated execution. That changes in 2D. So in 2D, all trade messages generated and reported are going to look, are going to be reported whether or not an execution occurred. So there can be trade messages that do not result in an execution. Those are reported the same as if they were executed. And that's in alignment with what's reported in non-OTC equity scenarios in CAT today. So what that's going to look like, again, kind of the core change in how we define our market structure is once 2D goes live, OTC link will be considered a route and destination. As a route and destination, OTC link is not the intended recipient of the trade message, which is the delta between our market structure and the order-based market. And CAT reflects that delta by requiring the subscriber or OTC link ATS to include a handle and instruction values of delivered to and delivered from that designate the MP ID of the intended counterparty in which the trade message was directed. So the order event or the trade message is going to be reflected in an order event the exact same way any non-OTC equity order would be reflected, with the change being that the delivered to would always be populated in cases where the message is sent from the order originator, and then delivered from in cases where the order is directed from the quoting participant back to the order originator. The other difference, just to note quickly, is we have the concept of counter messages or no counter messages. The counter message is going to be a material value that will have to be added to the order accepted events that OTC link creates to reflect cases where the message is a result of a counter offer, a counter message. The value of no counter and CTR is also required in cases where the trade message is not eligible for a counter. Aside from those two kind of core elements, along with the quote ID being included in the order route event created by OTC link and then sent to the counterparty destination, there should be no material changes between what's reportable in CAT today and what would be reportable to reflect the OTC message construct. The example at the bottom of this slide just provides kind of a high-level depiction of a typical order route scenario. Again, relatively self-explanatory, but in terms of the trade message being reflected as an order, broker-dealer one would report the new order event as a MINO, the associated order route event directed to, again, OTC link. OTC link would then report the order accepted event. They would include the handling instruction value of delivered to market maker one, market maker one again reflects the MPID of the quoting participant whose trade message the broker-dealer is trying to hit, and then the associated order route event directed to market maker 1 from OTC Link ATS. Again, as mentioned before, the quote ID will be the quote ID assigned by OTC Link ATS, and that's going to perform the linkage between the trade event and the quote that CAT will essentially surveil between the trade message and the quote. I should point out that previously the quote ID as well as the quote key date were included in the trade event, the MEOT event. CAT ultimately removed those values from the trade event to reflect where the quote lives. The quote lives within OTC Link ATS systems. The quote does not live necessarily at the trade event level. So to kind of reflect what the market structure looks like more accurately, they did move the obligation to report the quote ID and the quote key date from the trade event to the order route event. So the kind of the net there is subscribers will have no obligation to report any quote ID other than the quote ID that they may report as part of the initial new quote and routed quote events. Then finally, market maker 1 would report the order accepted event, and if that trade is ultimately executed, the associated MEOT event. Another item that I want to point out, and we've had several questions on what changes, if any, will be required on the fixed execution drop copy. There should be no changes required. OTC Link ATS is going to function exactly the same way it functioned in 2A and before we even thought about CAT. In cases where the execution occurred, the execution is going to be reportable by the executing party. FINRA has defined the executing party as the party who performed the last action, so it doesn't necessarily need to be the market maker, although in most cases it will be the market maker. But in either case, that party will be identified on the fixed execution drop copy, just like it is today. So I think that's good news for firms who believe there may be changes necessitated by CAT. CAT does not change trade reporting obligations, and therefore the fixed execution drop copy does not need to be supplemented to reflect CAT. Can we move to the next slide? Again, we covered most of what's in this slide. This is more for reference, and we'll send out these materials after the call, but really the core points we wanted to make here is the additional delivered to and delivered from values to reflect the counterparty destination, as well as the counter and no counter values to reflect whether or not the trade message was the product of a counter message or whether the trade message is not counterable. Again, other than that, there should be no material changes to the underlying messaging structure, which we believe, again, fits directly into the generation of a CAT event. Move to the next slide. Again, this is a similar workflow as we discussed 2 slides ago. Difference here is reflect the order created is represented an AI customer order. Should note again that OTC Link views its infrastructure as riskless principle-based infrastructure. So, we believe that there's no agency flow directly from the broker-dealer subscriber to OTC Link ATS. So we believe that we receive orders that were created on a riskless principle basis. And because of that, there's going to be no need to link the customer order that's reflected in the new order event by our subscriber or a broker-dealer client of one of our subscribers to the transactional message. We'll discuss that in more detail in the next webinar, but that's essentially going to be a product of the YE flag, where representative orders do not require linkage to the ultimate customer order.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt. I know just from the question box that there may be some issue with people viewing the slides in line with what Chris is referring to. So to answer another question that's in there, this will all be made available after the fact. Copy will be available tomorrow to everybody who's logged on today, so you can both hear Chris's description and view the deck and be able to put some things together.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan.
Sure. I don't know if you had more to go through, Chris. Otherwise, we can turn it to questions in a minute.
I don't. The scenario that I'm referring to, again, is the same general construct as the previous order lifecycle event or trade message lifecycle event that I mentioned before. The only other item that I wanted to touch upon before questions is methods of reporting quote events. So again, we have the exemptive relief that eliminates reporting obligations of quotes sent via manual systems until 2023. For firms who do send quotes to link ATS via an OMS, we just wanted to note that we would ask that you coordinate with Link ATS so that we can ensure that the quote ID between the quote sent event or the routed quote event and the quote received event are in alignment. Again, we were hopeful that firms who do elect to report quote events because they leverage an electronic system would use the quote ID that we generate that will allow for consistency between the transactional event and the quote event. It'll eliminate opportunity for error. And just wanted to note there's a few different ways that firms can elect to ensure that quote ID is consistent. One being scraping the multicast market data feed to reflect the quote ID that we generate on the new quote event and the routed quote event, or obviously leveraging OTC Link as a CAT submitter where we can generate the new quote and routed quote events on your behalf. I think one more item that I just wanted to mention is we've had questions on what are the material differences between the new quote and routed quote events and the quote received event. The answer to that is nothing. We advocated for one-sided reporting where OTC Link ATS reports a received quote event, just like we do today, and started in 2A. That argument was not accepted by the regulators, so there is the two-sided reporting between OTC Link ATS, essentially reflecting the same material items that would be reported by the subscriber. However, there is going to be a delta between the new quote sent and the received quote timestamps. There should be some degree of line latency, although we, again, define a quote as being generated at the time it's displayed by OTC Link IDQS. So we're unsure of what that timestamp difference is intended to kind of elucidate for the regulators, but just wanted to note that there will be that expected difference between the new quote sent and received quote events. And Dan, that's all I had. Again, the intent here was to provide kind of a high-level overview and hopefully not add more confusion to the matrix and really try to emphasize the fact that OTC Link trade messages do have the same kind of organic construct as any other order-based message, and all of the values are pulled from the fix protocol that we leverage and are easily transferable to CAT. And that's going to be the case whether or not OTC Link reports the activity or the subscriber reports the activity. I think that's good news in terms of any heavy lift for near-term implementation seems to be out the window.
All right, thanks, Chris. And just a reminder to everybody, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, of course, you can contact us after, but you can also use the question box on the dashboard you should have on your screen and type in a question there. I'm going to give Chris 1 second to catch his breath while we poll for questions, and then we do have a few that are already in the box, so I'll read some of those. Some are more specific to the extent we don't get to it or we don't respond here. We can certainly have a conversation afterwards, but some I think may be worthwhile for the group as a whole to hear the answer to. I will get started at the top, and since you have the lawyer, I'll opine on it for a second. The question is, what advice do you have for mapping which quotes are required to have the updated status when a book is opened or closed? And just to note, the question is framed as what advice do we have? Of course, we are not in a position to give legal or regulatory advice here. We try to give as much information as we possibly can so that the industry is kind of lined up and in order, and we have an idea of what people's questions are, so we can help facilitate some of that communication with the regulators. But of course, this is not, we're not in a position to give that kind of advice. So we'll frame it in the context of giving additional information. So Chris, I'll read it again and turn it back to you. The question is really around mapping what quotes are required to have the updated status when a book is opened or closed.
Right. So I think that's relatively answerable without your caveat, and thanks for that, Dan, because I tend to forget that I'm a lawyer and overspeak. CAT's fairly, or the CAT specification's fairly definitive in what's reportable in terms of the quote status of, or the quote status event. It's all updates to a quote that are not end of day close quotes. And end of day close quotes would be defined as OTC Link essentially shutting off the quote if the trader did not do that on their own until the next trading day. So any other cases would be reportable in terms of the creation of the quote status event. And that includes started day quotes, and I know subscribers have had questions on that. Effectively, I know we define the open quote processes just as automatic as close quotes. The regulators have not. So the regulators have not given into our arguments that that should be likewise an automatic process.
All right, thank you for that. There are a couple of questions, the next two questions, that are really focused on quote IDs or quote message IDs. So one is regarding what happens with new quote message IDs for quotes that are rejected. And then to follow up on that, there's a question with respect to the amount of value able to be entered into the submission, the quote submission message, and whether that has enough values to guarantee uniqueness across the day, and how we plan to handle that, whether somebody is working with us and coordinating with us, or whether they decide to go in a different direction.
Right. So the first question in terms of the rejection of the quote ID, again, is going to be populated by the subscriber who does report the new quote event and the routed quote event will have the quote ID associated with those two events. The rejection of that quote will obviously be a reject back to the market maker. I think that raises an interesting question of whether or not that would be even reportable, because there's going to be no audit trail that CAT will be able to derive kind of the generation of that quote. I think that's a good question that we may need to run by the regulators, just because is there a quote if link ATS did not receive and accept the quote? The second question, in terms of quote ID, so the quote IDs that we generate, we can certainly ensure uniqueness. I think one of the benefits of how CAT reflects the quote modification construct is the fact that there's only the concept of only one quote. So a subscriber is only permitted to send OTC link IDQS one quote at a given time in that particular security. When that quote is no longer displayed, or if it's canceled, CAT considers that a quote cancellation, and then any associated new quote event would be a new quote event. So essentially the quote ID is going to version across those quote events.
All right, and I'm just going to reiterate the answer to one of the other questions here, which is around sharing this presentation. And just to make sure everyone's clear, yes, tomorrow you will all get a link. It will be available, both the verbal presentation as well as the deck. There is a final question here that I think, Chris, we can address, and then, similarly to how you've described the answer to several prior, there are things that we may go back on and talk to the regulator about, things that we may be able to address more specifically with a subscriber. For this question, the question is, if you generate quote submissions on behalf of market makers, will the timestamp of the quote send and the quote receive be the same? And I view the you in this circumstance, I believe, is us, but Chris, if you can address that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So that would be the material change between the new quote event and the quote received event, right? Whatever that timestamp differential happens to be, likely a few milliseconds at most. That's a question that we haven't asked. I'm not sure we want to ask that question, because that may pose challenges in terms of OTC link reporting that message. CAT certainly hasn't provided their opinion one way or the other than the fact that they've acknowledged the only material difference between the quote received and the quote sent events would be that timestamp differential. The regulators have acknowledged that concept in the context of options market maker quote reporting, and the deferment that the options market makers had. They acknowledged the fact that the timestamp between the quote sent and quote received is a material for surveillance. The way it works in the options world is the timestamp is populated by the options exchange who receives that quote. So that would be similar to how we would report that message. We would report when it was received, when the quote was received, and then we would report the time in which it entered into that order entry system. It's a good question. We don't have clarity on the value of, again, that differential between the quote received and quote sent events.
All right, that is the end of the questions. And Chris, thank you for the presentation, for addressing all of those. You can see the final slide that's up is contact information for Chris and for Bart Kreslak as well, and our general trading services line. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, and stay tuned for information on subsequent presentations like this one, again, one in August and one in September. With that, thanks everybody for joining, and we look forward to speaking with you all soon.
Thanks, Sam.